In the sprawling, often mythologized graveyard of rock and roll, the stories of the fallen tend to follow a familiar script. They are tales of meteoric rises and spectacular flameouts, of lives consumed by the very fame they chased. They become cautionary tales, grimly predictable arcs of genius and excess that we, the audience, have learned to recognize. But some stories refuse to fit the mold. They are stranger, more jagged, and infinitely more heartbreaking. They are less like a clear narrative and more like a puzzle with crucial pieces missing, leaving us to stare into the gaps, wondering what might have been. This is the story of a man who was less a musician and more a force of nature, a man who possessed a voice that seemed to be on loan from another world, an instrument of impossible range and terrifying emotional power. It could climb from a tender, whispered folk melody as delicate as a spider's web to a wild, primal avant-garde scream in the space of a single breath. He was a musical shapeshifter, a restless innovator who seemed to be perpetually at war with the expectations of his audience, his record label, and perhaps, most of all, himself. His name was Tim Buckley. To understand the phenomenon of Tim Buckley, you must first transport yourself back to the world that created him. The mid-1960s in America was a time of profound cultural schizophrenia. On one hand, there was the lingering black and white conformity of the post-war era. On the other, a vibrant technicolor youthquake was erupting, challenging every established norm. The polite acoustic folk revival, championed by figures like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, was being plugged in, amplified, and sent spiraling into the cosmos by the mind-expanding possibilities of psychedelia. This was the era of the generation gap, a chasm of understanding between parents who had survived the Depression and a war and their children, who were protesting a new one in Vietnam and demanding a new way of living, loving, and listening. The epicenters of this musical revolution were New York's Greenwich Village and, crucially for Tim's story, the sun-drenched bohemian enclave of Los Angeles. The clubs on the Sunset Strip, like the Troubadour and Whiskey A Go-Go, along with the wooded rustic homes of Laurel Canyon, became a fertile breeding ground for a new generation of musicians. They were ambitious, poetic, and fiercely individualistic, crafting a new sound that blended folk's lyrical intimacy with rock's visceral energy. Record labels like the fiercely independent and artist-friendly Elektra Records were actively searching for the next authentic voice, the next poet who could also sell records. It was a world that placed a premium on originality, on introspection, and on a kind of romantic, tortured artistry. It was into this vibrant, chaotic, and hopeful world that Tim Buckley emerged, seemingly out of nowhere. And in 1966, there was no voice more original, no artist more romantic than his. But the myth of the tortured artist often obscures a more conventional beginning. Timothy Charles Buckley III was born in Washington, D.C. on Valentine's Day, 1947. His early life was nomadic, as his decorated war hero father moved the family around before they settled in the suburbs of Southern California. His was a household filled with music, but not the kind he would later become famous for. His mother Elaine had a classical background, while his father exposed him to the raw, emotional storytelling of country legends like Hank Williams and Johnny Cash. This early exposure to pure, unfiltered emotion would become a cornerstone of his own work. In high school in the city of Bell Gardens, he defied the stereotype of the brooding, reclusive musician. He was popular, athletic, and conventionally handsome. He was a co-captain of the school's football team, a quarterback who seemed destined for a very different kind of life. But beneath the all-American exterior, a restless musical soul was stirring. He played in local rock bands and was beginning to write his own songs, developing the powerful acrobatic voice that would soon become his trademark. His personal life, however, was already moving at a pace that outstripped his age. He fell deeply in love with a high school classmate, Mary Guibert. Theirs was an intense storybook romance that soon collided with adult reality. Mary became pregnant, and, in the socially conservative climate of 1965, the young couple did what was expected of them. They got married. Tim was just 18 years old. A year later, in November 1966, their son, Jeffrey Scott Buckley, was born. Tim was a father at 19, a man barely out of his own childhood, now saddled with the immense responsibilities of a wife and child. The pressure was immense, and the youthful marriage was not built to withstand it. It crumbled within a year. As his musical career began to ignite, Tim made a decision that would cast a long, dark shadow over his life and legacy. He walked away. He became a ghost in his son's life, a distant, mythical figure. He was chasing a dream, a sound that was calling to him with an irresistible force, and he left his first family behind in its pursuit. That same year, his pursuit began to pay off spectacularly. A demo tape found its way to Herb Cohen, the legendary and formidable manager of artists like Frank Zappa and Linda Ronstadt. Cohen was floored by the sheer, raw talent he heard and quickly signed the young Buckley, securing him a deal with Elektra Records. His 1966 self-titled debut album, Tim Buckley, was a stunning introduction. Produced by Paul Rothchild, who had also helmed The Doors' debut, the album presented Tim as a sensitive, romantic troubadour. The songs were filled with lush, slightly baroque folk rock arrangements, and soaring above it all was that voice, a pure multi-octave instrument that he controlled with an almost supernatural grace. It was a voice that could convey both youthful innocence and a world-weary sorrow that seemed far beyond his years. His 1967 follow-up, Goodbye and Hello, was even more ambitious. It was a quintessential album of the summer of love, a sprawling psychedelic folk epic. With its lush orchestration, politically charged lyrics, and a title track that was a multi-part suite, it perfectly captured the zeitgeist. It became his most commercially successful record, reaching the album charts and cementing his status as a critic's darling and a folk pop idol. He was a regular on the festival circuit and even made television appearances. He was handsome, he was poetic, and he possessed a voice that could break your heart. By all reasonable measures, he was on a clear upward trajectory to major stardom. He had a devoted fan base, a powerful record label behind him, and a sound that was both artistically credible and commercially viable. And then, with a resolve that baffled everyone around him, he decided to tear it all down. The first tremor of the earthquake to come arrived in 1969 with the album Happy Sad. The intricate, tightly arranged folk rock of his first two albums was gone, replaced by a looser, more hypnotic, and deeply improvisational sound. The songs were longer, more atmospheric, and built around the shimmering textures of David Friedman's vibraphone and the fluid, melodic lines of John Miller's acoustic bass. Heavily influenced by the modal jazz of Miles Davis, particularly the landmark album Kinda Blue, Happy Sad was a deliberate move away from pop structures. It was beautiful, dreamy, and meditative, but it was also a clear signal to his audience. Don't get comfortable. Though it confused many fans and was a commercial disappointment, it marked the beginning of his true artistic journey. He was no longer interested in being a pop star. He was following his muse into uncharted territory, and he didn't seem to care who, if anyone, was willing to follow him. What came next, however, was not just a step, but a radical, fearless leap into the creative abyss. Over the course of 1970, Tim Buckley would release a pair of albums so challenging, so experimental, and so breathtakingly uncompromising that they would effectively sever his ties with the mainstream forever. These were the albums that would make him a legend among the musical avant-garde and a commercial pariah to his record label. The first of these was Lorca, named in honor of the surrealist Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca, whose work was filled with themes of love, death, and tragic fate. The album was a dark, brooding, and largely a tonal landscape of sound. Conventional melody, rhythm, and song structure were almost entirely abandoned. Instead, Tim used his voice as an instrument of pure, raw emotion. He wailed, he moaned, he whispered, and he screamed, exploring the absolute extremes of his vocal range with a terrifying intensity. On tracks like the title song, he holds a single keening note for what feels like an eternity, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was the sound of an artist dismantling his own gift, breaking it down to its most elemental components to see what lay inside. The reaction was one of utter bewilderment. His record label, Elektra, was horrified. His fans, who had come for the gentle love songs of Goodbye and Hello, were confronted with what sounded to many like a harrowing musical nervous breakdown. If Lorca was a challenge, his next album, Star Sailor, released later that same year, was an all-out declaration of war on musical convention. It remains one of the most audacious and unclassifiable albums ever released by a major artist. It was a dense, complex, and exhilarating fusion of free jazz, 20th century classical dissonance, and psychedelic rock. Here, Tim's voice became a pure texture, a human synthesizer, as one critic aptly called it. With the help of multi-tracking, he layered his own vocals into dense choral harmonies, wordless shrieks, and acrobatic solos, creating a sound that was both beautiful and profoundly alienating. It was as if he had absorbed the spirits of Ornette Coleman, Karlheinz Stockhausen, and a celestial choir all at once. The album's centerpiece, Song to the Siren, was a rare and breathtaking moment of conventional beauty, a haunting ballad that would, ironically, become his most famous and beloved song decades after his death. But at the time, it was an outlier, an accessible island in a sea of avant-garde chaos. The commercial and critical backlash was swift and brutal. His original folk audience abandoned him in droves, feeling betrayed and confused. His concerts became confrontational, almost performance art events. Fans would shout requests for his old, gentle songs, only for Tim to respond by launching into another 20-minute free-form improvisation with his band, seemingly delighting in their frustration. He had finally achieved total uncompromised artistic freedom, but at a tremendous cost. He had followed his muse into the deepest part of the wilderness, and now he was completely, commercially alone. The personal toll of this self-imposed artistic exile was immense. Tim Buckley, the critically acclaimed artist, was broke. He couldn't get his experimental band booked into clubs, and his records weren't selling. The avant-garde genius was now facing the grim, mundane reality of needing to pay rent and feed his family. And so, he pivoted again, this time in a direction that was, in its own way, just as shocking as his move into the avant-garde. After a 2-year silence, he returned, but the ethereal poet was gone. In his place was a swaggering, macho provocateur. He decided to embrace the profane. Starting with his 1972 album Greetings from L.A., Tim reinvented himself as a purveyor of what he called sex funk. The music was loud, groovy, and built on greasy guitar riffs and a pounding rhythm section. The lyrics, once filled with poetic abstractions, were now raw, explicit, and almost comically direct tales of sexual conquest and carnal frustration. On songs like Get on Top, he left absolutely nothing to the imagination. He followed this with 2 more albums in a similar vein, Sophronia and Look at the Fool. This new direction was just as controversial as his last. The small, devoted cult of fans who had followed him into his experimental phase now felt utterly betrayed. Meanwhile, the mainstream rock audience he was now trying to court found his new, hypersexualized persona to be forced and slightly ridiculous. He had traded his artistic integrity for a shot at commercial success, and in the end, he failed to achieve either. He found himself trapped in a no-man's land of his own making, a musical chameleon who had changed his colors so many times that he had become invisible. To truly understand this tumultuous journey, we have to look past the album covers and into the character of the man himself. For this, the accounts of those who knew him best, like his longtime lead guitarist and close friend Lee Underwood, are invaluable. Underwood's memoir, Blue Melody, paints a portrait of a man of profound and often frustrating contradictions. He was an intense musical intellectual, constantly reading, listening, and absorbing new ideas. He introduced his bandmates to the work of jazz masters like Miles Davis and Charles Mingus, and avant-garde composers like Luciano Berio. He was deadly serious about his art, but he also possessed a wicked, often juvenile sense of humor. He was a notorious prankster, a man who loved to shock and provoke, both on stage and off. He was charming and charismatic one moment, moody and withdrawn the next. His relationships were often as tumultuous as his music, and through it all, there was the voice. It was his obsession, an instrument he was constantly working on, constantly trying to perfect and expand. Underwood recalled hearing him in hotel rooms, letting out these otherworldly sounds, running scales and practicing extended vocal techniques. He wasn't just a singer, he was a vocal athlete, and he treated his unique gift with the discipline and seriousness of a virtuoso. But there was always the shadow, the part of his life he rarely spoke of, his abandoned son, Jeff. For the first 8 years of Jeff's life, Tim was a complete non-entity, a ghost known only through a handful of photographs and his mother's records. He provided almost no financial or emotional support. Finally, in the spring of 1975, as Tim was beginning to pull his life back together, something shifted. Jeff, then a curious and sensitive 8-year-old, expressed a strong desire to finally meet the father he had never known. A meeting was arranged at Tim's home in Santa Monica. It was the first and only real time they would ever spend together. By all accounts, it was a gentle, positive, and poignant encounter. Tim was reportedly warm and engaging. He played guitar for his son, and they spent a weekend getting to know each other, 2 strangers bound by blood and an almost supernatural musical talent. Jeff was reportedly mesmerized by his father, this charismatic, almost mythical figure who had suddenly materialized in his life. For Tim, the meeting seemed to stir a sense of responsibility, perhaps even regret. It was a fragile, hopeful beginning, a first step toward healing a deep and painful wound, but it would also be their final goodbye. By the early months of 1975, Tim Buckley was actively attempting to pull his life and career out of their long nosedive. He had married his longtime girlfriend, Judy Sutcliffe, in 1974 and had formally adopted her son, Taylor, providing a stable family life he had never known. Crucially, he had reportedly kicked his heroin habit and was living a relatively clean life, his only vices being beer and wine. He was writing new material, and there was talk of a comeback album, one that would finally merge his incredible vocal talents with more mature, accessible songwriting. He put together a new band and embarked on a small tour that was met with enthusiastic crowds. The tour culminated in a sold-out show at a club called the Starwood in Dallas, Texas, on June 28, 1975. The performance was, by all accounts, a triumph. The audience was ecstatic, and Tim was at the peak of his vocal powers. He was reportedly in high spirits after the show, feeling that his career was finally, truly getting back on track. He was energized, happy, and filled with plans for the future. He flew home to his family in Santa Monica the next day, June 29th. The mood was celebratory. That evening, he and his wife Judy went to visit the home of a casual friend, a man named Richard Keeling. It was here, in this moment of triumph and celebration, that a single reckless and catastrophic decision was made, a decision that would end his life and seal his tragic legend. At Keeling's house, there was heroin. Tim, who had been clean from the drug for a considerable time, was in a reckless, celebratory mood. According to Judy's later testimony, he saw Keeling with a small bag of white powder. In a fateful split-second misjudgment, he apparently believed it was cocaine, a drug he sometimes used recreationally. Without asking, Tim, the man who had survived years of artistic risk and personal turmoil, impulsively took a significant amount of the powder and snorted it. But it wasn't cocaine, it was high-purity heroin. The effect was immediate and devastating. For a regular seasoned user, the dose would have been dangerously large. For Tim, whose tolerance had dropped to zero after a long period of abstinence, it was an instant death sentence. His body, completely unprepared, went into shock. He was immediately in severe distress. Alarmed, his friends in a panic drove him back to his own home. In a tragically common and fatal mistake in overdose situations, they put him to bed, hoping he could simply sleep it off. Judy checked on him later that evening. His lips had turned a deathly shade of blue, and a long single tear had traced a path down his cheek, as if in a final silent expression of regret. He was not breathing. Paramedics were called, but it was far too late. Timothy Charles Buckley was pronounced dead at 9:42 p.m. on June 29, 1975. The official coroner's report stated the cause of death was acute heroin, morphine, and ethanol intoxication due to inhalation and ingestion of overdose. The aftermath was a grim and sordid affair. The police investigation led to the arrest of Richard Keeling. He was initially charged with murder, a charge that was later reduced to involuntary manslaughter. He was ultimately sentenced to just 120 days in jail and 4 years of probation, a lenient sentence that enraged Tim's grieving family and friends. The death of Tim Buckley was not the glamorous, mythologized end of a rock star. It was a tragic, almost banal accident, a story of a man who made a fatal miscalculation in a single moment of reckless Jay. It was the cruelest irony of all. After surviving years of deliberate artistic and commercial risks, he died not in a blaze of glory, but from a moment of lethal carelessness. The significance of Tim Buckley's life and death has only deepened and grown more complex over the years. At the time of his passing, his death was noted in the music press, but he was not the revered icon he is today. He was largely seen as a cult artist, a brilliant talent who had lost his way, but his influence, like a ghost, began to quietly permeate the music of subsequent generations. Artists in the post-punk and alternative rock scenes like Susie and the Banshees, Cocteau Twins and This Mortal Coil, whose famous ethereal cover of Song to the Siren introduced Tim's work to a whole new audience in the 1980s, all owed a profound debt to his fearless experimentation. His willingness to use the voice as a texture, as an instrument of pure, primal emotion, paved the way for countless artists who refused to be bound by the conventions of pop singing. But his most significant and most heartbreaking legacy would be channeled through the son he barely knew. Jeff Buckley grew up in the long, complicated shadow of a father he knew only through a handful of records and his mother's stories. He inherited his father's astonishing vocal range, his ethereal good looks, and his restless, eclectic musical soul. When Jeff emerged as a solo artist in the early 1990s, the world was left speechless. It was as if Tim had been reincarnated, his voice miraculously reborn in a new generation. Jeff's meteoric rise and the release of his own masterpiece, the album Grace, forced a massive worldwide reevaluation of his father's work. Suddenly, people were digging out those challenging, long-forgotten albums like Lorca and Star Sailor and discovering the breathtaking genius that had been there all along. The story became a kind of gothic rock and roll myth, the tale of a father and son, two brilliant comets who blazed across the sky and burned out far too soon. In a final, eerie and devastating twist of fate, Jeff himself would die tragically young, drowning accidentally in the Wolf River in Memphis in 1997, at the age of 30. The parallel was inescapable and devastating. It sealed the Buckley legacy as one of breathtaking generational talent and unspeakable generational tragedy. In the end, how do we make sense of the whirlwind that was Tim Buckley? He was never an easy artist to love, and by many accounts, he was not an easy man to know. He was a storm of contradictions, a sensitive poet and a crude provocateur, a fiercely disciplined musician and a chaotic man, a beloved son and an absent father. He refused to be categorized, refused to stand still, and refused to give his audience the comfort of what they already knew or expected. He demanded that we follow him on his wild, unpredictable journey, no matter how strange or difficult the path became. His death at 28 places him in the sad, mythical pantheon of rock and roll's lost youth, but his story feels different, more complex. It wasn't a slow fade into oblivion, but a sudden, shocking blackout. It was the final cruel paradox for a man whose life was a series of them. On the very day he seemed to have finally found his way back, he took a single, fatal wrong turn. His enduring legacy is that voice, a voice that still haunts and mesmerizes us decades later. It is the sound of pure, unbridled, and sometimes terrifying freedom. It is the sound of an artist relentlessly reaching for something beyond the veil, something beautiful, dangerous, and profoundly true. Tim Buckley was a comet who lit up the sky with a brilliant, erratic, and unforgettable light. And his music, in all its challenging and beautiful forms, remains a timeless testament to the glory, the sorrow, and the devastating cost of a life lived without a map.